So we're going to have a look at this, and we're going to talk about food, because I think it's quite a relevant subject for the last 12 months or so. So let's talk about food. If we've learned nothing from the last 12 months or so, then it's this. Food and power are connected to one another. The war in Ukraine has shown us just how volatile our food supplies can be. Grain and wheat shortages have driven up basic food costs. Rising energy prices have driven up the production costs and the distribution costs to get us food. All of which has helped sort of contribute to that growing cost of living crisis, which at worst has forced people to choose between, as we've heard lots in the last year, heating and eating. And at best has forced many of us to cut down, cut back and cut out on essentials, never mind luxuries. And the last 12 months of watching the rising cost of food and everyday prices has for good reason frightened many of us in this country. The foundation upon which we have been living for so many years about food security that we've built up, and fuel security as well, has been badly shaken. And perhaps, I'm not saying this is true, but perhaps in the future we may not even be first in line to receive grain and fuel to produce our food. Now, to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know of anyone in the UK who has yet starved to death because of the cost of food, fuel and mortgages. But I do know this, many people are living on the edge of despair and hopelessness and facing overwhelming tides of anxiety and fear. And for many, living on the breadline has never been a more dismally appropriate expression than in 2023. Lessons should be learned, and I believe they are being learned, about food security and the processes we need to preserve it. But what may be a new lesson to many of us in 21st century UK was nothing new to those living in the biblical times. In the Bible, the availability and quality of food was a good marker between the haves and the have-nots. Food insecurity in biblical times was commonplace, not just because of seasonal fluctuations, but also regarding access to it. Most people would have been living at or around subsistence level. Inadequate amounts and variable quality would have impacted on people's health and well-being, just as it can today. If you have ever wondered why there were so many poor, sick people in the Gospels and so few rich, sick people, then the answer will have something to do with food poverty. The elite would have been able to afford to source quality food in sufficient and abundant quantities. The poor would have been left with the scraps thrown from their master's table, to use a well-known phrase. And there is a reason why Jesus included the phrase, "Give us today our daily bread," in his Lord's Prayer. It wasn't a request for spiritual nourishment as we see it today more often than not. This was a cry to God to provide for our basic, simple need of food. You don't have to go too far in the Bible before you hit the first reference to food. The creation story is all about preparing a world in which we have no wants. And on day 6, we get the mention of livestock and seed-bearing fruit and plants for us to eat. Adam's role was a gardener, growing and planting what he needs. But with the fall came the cursed ground and the end of secure food supplies. We don't really know why Cain's offering to God of fruits of the soil was rejected or not accepted. But the first murder in the Bible, Abel, involved, at least in part, food. Much later, Joseph showed Pharaoh of the need to preserve portions of good harvests for days of famine, and in doing so, was able to provide for the hungry and the destitute, not just in their country, but from all around the nations. It's not God's will that people go hungry. Quite the opposite. He wants people to be fed. In the wilderness, the Exodus, God demonstrated this directly when he fed his people. Ezekiel condemned leaders of Israel for not feeding their people. And Isaiah declared that it was God's will the people share their bread with the hungry. And the Bible speaks of establishing a God's kingdom in terms of abundant food and feasting. The phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey, becomes not just a rallying call to a physical destination, but a promise from God of his abundant goodness to his people. And in Isaiah, the prophet uses the abundance of food as an indicator to describe that time when all God's enemies will be defeated and he will be victorious. He says, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines. And we shouldn't miss the connection between the feeding of the 5,000 and the previous passage, Herod's notorious birthday party. In the context of these two passages, a ruler and a prophet collide. On the one side, a perverse celebration of the corruptness of power and wealth. On the other, the will of God. The powerful and the political against the poor. Tyranny against peace. Excess over hunger. Futility against hope. Death against life. The love of want against the love of God. And as a result, John loses his head, and it's served up grotesquely on a platter like another dish for a party. Whereas Jesus produced a life-giving feast, embodying the gracious abundance of God. So what can we learn from this passage on the feeding of the 5,000? Well, it demonstrates two things. First, it reiterates God's will to feed hungry people. And secondly, it anticipates the coming age in which God will supply victoriously an abundance of food. The setting itself is a deserted, remote and solitary place that evokes echoes of the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, but being fed by God. In Matthew's account, the crowds gather in a remote place, and Jesus shows compassion on them, even though he himself is mourning the vicious death of his friend John. And when the spectre of hunger raises its head and the disciples try to send the crowd home, Jesus challenges them, and perhaps us too, with the words, "You feed them." That is, don't take the easy road here and send them home, back to the villages where they can buy food. You feed them. Don't let them fend for themselves. They need your help, so help them. The disciples produce 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and there's no boy mentioned in this passage. At this point, Jesus then takes over and hosts a meal. And in verse 19, he blesses the food and gives it to the disciples to distribute to the crowd. And the language of verse 19, taking loaves, blessed, broke, gave to the disciples, ate and all. Reminiscent of the supper, of the Last Supper scene. All those words appear in chapter 26 and 27. But this is not the Last Supper, but the two are linked by God's blessing and his continued desire to provide for his people and those in need. And Jesus demonstrates God's will that hungry people must be fed. God intervenes into the scene to multiply the limited resources so that there is an abundance of food for 5,000 or more. But more significantly, there was also leftovers, 12 baskets full, suggestive of the abundance to come when God's kingdom is fully established. So the feeding of the 5,000 reminds us that God is not just concerned for our spiritual well-being, but his love also includes his care for our physical well-being too. In this case, feeding the hungry. Jesus declared that nations will be judged in part on whether they provided food for the hungry. That's a sobering thought, given what we have already gone through in recent times. How would we feel if the boot really was suddenly on the other end of the foot? Maybe Jesus is telling us today that we need to widen our ambition further, because we do give. Let's not forget that. But maybe we should be giving more. Jesus commanded his followers to feed the hungry, but he also demonstrated that if we trust God, if we trust him in this, then there will be extras. 12 basketfuls left over. Picture language for enough for all, if we just trust and share. Amen.
Amen.